Well, first, I'd like to thank you, Terry, for the kind introduction and the opportunity to speak at this event, especially to people who care so very much about their water resources. I've been invited to talk today about accelerating hydroclimatic change and what it might mean to you as a cottager here in Ontario, and also as a cottager, someone who cares about water, lives on a lake or a river elsewhere in Canada. My life and work in water has taken me to lakes in every province and territory in Canada and many other places in the world. I believe now that I actually perhaps qualify as a person of the lake persuasion. This summer alone, I visited and examined issues in some of the most remarkable lake systems in Canada. And while many of these lakes remain very attractive places to live and visit, it's clear that there are a lot of challenges that we face that were already serious before warming temperatures began to noticeably accelerate hydroclimatic processes. And as Terry said, some of the news is not good. The Bredor Lakes in Nova Scotia are, of course, stunning. The region, unfortunately, is threatened on land by changes in the timing and nature of precipitation that have already begun to alter winter snowpack and snow cover, as well as the duration during which freshwater lakes are covered by ice. And this is a common problem. These changes, in tandem with seawater intrusion into freshwater aquifers and groundwater overdraft in some areas, are already undermining water quality and security. And I should point out there, too, that sea level rise is a huge threat to low-lying Cape Breton Island. It's projected that as much as 40% of the area of Cape Breton could be inundated by the end of the century. And it's held there, locally, that reaffirmation of traditional and local connection to place could do much to slow the accelerating eco-hydroclimatic effects that locals were witnessing. This affirmation can only yield desirable results, however, if local Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal perspectives are actually shared and equally weighted in policy decisions. And I have to say that this is likely to be complicated, as relations are such that some First Nations on Cape Breton Island are reluctant to publicly declare water security vulnerabilities for fear that non-Aboriginals may poison their remaining supplies. At a recent conference I attended on the future of Great Lakes system held in Buffalo, scientists claim that the Great Lakes now are the most compromised and most invaded freshwater system in the world. Well, that's not good. And I think people in this audience will certainly remember that in the 1960s and early 1970s, Lake Erie became eutrophic, which is to say that it suffered from excessive algal growth and subsequent oxygen loss in bottom waters in late summer. And some $5 billion was invested through the 1972 Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement to address point source pollution from municipalities and industries. But now we find that Lake Erie is backsliding as a result of increasing sources of diffuse contamination and also the effects of climate change. And algal blooms in Lake Erie are now said to be worse than they were in the 1960s before the first cleanup began. Beloved Lake Huron. And in 1986, the waters of Lake Huron were so high that they were damaging lakeside properties. Now declining lake levels are a real concern, as are fish die-offs and emerging algal blooms. So let's talk for a moment about why it's so difficult to address these kinds of problems. And I think it's important to recognize that residents of the Great Lakes Basin have faced these situations before and have successfully acted upon them. And in essence, you fix these problems once, and what you find is that you need to do it again. And what I see from the outside is an unpleasant fight has to be rejoined. The question becomes obvious. How do you constantly revive sometimes tired relations and interests whose efforts over the two generations have once again arrived at a situation where the problem is surfaced once more? And I should point out that the situation you face here describes the circumstances faced in many other basins, not just in North America, but around the world. So you're lucky to have organizations like the ones you belong to, and lucky also to have an umbrella under FOCA. The biggest challenge in sustaining efforts to protect lakes and rivers in North America is a common one. How do you find the motivation to trust one another and to work together when it's easier not to, or where there have been so many reasons not to in the past? And what I see is that both international and Canadian example suggests that two things are often necessary to get things moving again. And the first is a crisis. And as I will explain, I think we are facing one. And the second is a deadline. Some basins are more proactive in this regard than in others, and there have been some successes. Many of the usual suspects have appeared in the Lake of the Woods and Rainy River watershed that cause problems with lake water quality. And these are ones common to all of you, and you know them. They include population shifts from seasonal cottage use to permanent residence, more roads and infrastructure, wetland loss, water regulation and flooding problems, outdated public perceptions relating to the state of the health of the watershed and your lake, unresolved and uncharacterized Indigenous water rights issues, antiquated government structures, government cutbacks, and heavy investments in a seemingly immovable status quo. Everyone involved in the management of this lake system is discovering just how much it costs to manage systems that once managed themselves on their own for free. And in addition to the usual suspects, there's some additional challenges, including significant nutrient loading and other forms of pollution, industrial and agricultural pressures under changing economic circumstances, concerns related to forestry practices, and climate change impacts. But what the residents of the Lake Woods have discovered is that in the absence of adequate funding and monitoring, they really have no choice but to cooperate, and that's what they're doing. The multi-agency arrangement they signed in 2009 suggests that there is wide latitude for cooperation in dealing with these problems. I believe the Northwest Territories water stewardship strategy, which protects huge systems such as Great Slave and Great Bear Lakes, is one of the most thoughtful and comprehensive in the world. That means we can do that in this country. The impetus for creating it was a pipeline proposal. The deadline for creating it was the pending devolution of political powers from the federal government to local, territory, and Aboriginal governments. The Northwest Territories had to get a house in order to be worthy of receiving these powers, and getting their house in order demanded full Aboriginal involvement. And pending transboundary negotiations with upstream Alberta and British Columbia, they may succeed in doing this. The Okanagan Lakes in British Columbia are another example of how crises and deadline shaped action. After a lengthy drought and a devastating fire season in 2003 threatened homes and livelihoods of everyone in the basin, the Okanagan Basin Water Board recognized the problem that population growth and climate change were creating. And in 2006, the board created the Okanagan Water Stewardship Council, which offers advice on how to deal with rapid hydroclimatic change in the basin and how to adapt to it. The Columbia Basin is another case in point. Most of the lakes in this basin are no longer lakes, but hydropower reservoirs. The impetus for change is the loss of salmon in the upper regions of the basin and the resulting deterioration of aquatic ecosystem health, which found expression through the lingering sense of social injustice brought about by the damming of the Columbia River beginning in the 1930s. Some of these problems go back a long way. The pending deadline is reconsideration of the Columbia River Treaty, which by law is a formal process which must begin next year. In a recent interview, FOCA asked me a very important question. What does a changing climate situation mean for our waterfront communities? Well, my answer is there's a great deal we don't know about our freshwater systems that streams and lakes will teach us as temperatures rise and as precipitation patterns change. And I said, if you have a house on a lake or river in Canada, well, you're going to have a ringside seat to observe and measure those changes, which we're only beginning to anticipate and we don't yet fully understand. And I would like to suggest to you that The situation with respect to freshwater lakes in Canada is probably most interesting when we take a look at places where temperatures rise and precipitation patterns change in the way in which they are changing in the Lake Winnipeg Basin. So let's go ringside at Lake Winnipeg and see what the people who live in the 10,000 cottages on the shores of that magnificent body of inland water learned about the nature and extent of hydroclimatic change that has already occurred at the center of our country and our continent. Hydrologists, not just in Canada, but worldwide, have been reporting observed changes in the rate and manner in which water moves through the global hydrological cycle. And it's probably safe to say, however, that very few of even the most far-seeing researchers were able to recognize just how serious the consequences of this might be. So please allow me to identify some of the telekinetically connected hydroclimatic effects that have been identified as serious threats to our ability to adapt and as elements that increase our vulnerability everywhere. I will first explain the link that appears to exist between how much sea ice and snow cover there is in the Arctic, and also the effect of Arctic cold on the intensity and stability of the band of winds that circulate around the northern hemisphere that we call the jet stream. I will then demonstrate a link between a meandering jet stream and the movement of warm and cold fronts into places in which they don't often go and don't normally stay. This may ultimately be of concern to all of us because it's this emerging pattern that appears to be causing the heat waves and droughts that we see to persist far longer and to appear more widely. I will then introduce a very simple principle of atmospheric physics that explains how a warmer atmosphere can transport more water vapor and how this simple fact results in the potential for heavier rainfalls. And finally, I hope to demonstrate how all of these factors together are creating more frequent and more intense flooding events of the magnitude that we have been witnessing, not just here in Ontario or in Alberta, Saskatchewan, or Manitoba, but widely in Canada, but just as widely throughout the Northern Hemisphere. And from this, you may be able to draw your own conclusions about changing hydroclimatic conditions in Canada and what they might mean in terms of protecting both your cottage and your cottage way of life, wherever it's located. So to begin, one of the most significant recent advancements in hydrometeorology is the realization of the global importance of the refrigerating influence of polar ice. Three factors related to the extent and duration of Arctic sea ice have emerged as having great significance to the lives of every person on this planet. The first is the amount of heat required to melt sea ice. The second is the potential effect of sea ice melt on ocean acidification and the reliability of deep ocean currents. The third is the profound influence of Arctic cold on the stability of weather conditions further south and globally. Water, as all of you know, is an almost otherworldly substance, and once it's frozen, it takes an enormous amount of energy and heat to weaken the hydrogen bonds that hold water molecules in the lockstep crystalline structure of ice. The strange thing is that you have to put all the heat in before any change whatsoever occurs within that crystalline structure. And it's only when ice reaches 0 degrees Celsius that it melts. And from this, we see why ice and snow are such effective climatic refrigerants. The problem, however, is that the moment after solid ice collapses into liquid water, all of the heat you add afterwards will suddenly make temperatures rise, thereby increasing evaporation. Polar ice is now seen as a thermostat that governs major weather patterns globally. And it's now feared that the decrease in the extent and thickness of sea ice could be the parameter that's feeding all of the increases that are causing concern over climate warming. While it appears that it will be less this year, the area of Arctic ice that melted last summer was 2 million square kilometers larger than the entire area of Canada as a landmass. Sea ice is increasingly seen as a thermal helmet without which climate warming can give the Earth system a shot straight to the head. If we lose the refrigerating influence of Arctic sea ice, global temperatures will skyrocket with possible releases of methane in the permafrost zone that will further exacerbate warming. And as I will talk about later in this presentation, there's evidence from Siberia that suggests that this may already be happening. In addition to thinning and the reduction in the extent and duration of sea ice cover in the Arctic, extreme weather events in the form of Arctic cyclones are breaking up the ice further, accelerating melt. And I think this is a very interesting picture because physically and figuratively, the result resembles a frozen hurricane. The loss of Arctic sea ice and the reduction of the extent and duration of snow cover in the Northern Hemisphere are reducing the temperature gradient between the pole and the tropics. And it's this difference in temperature between the cold north and the lower latitudes that largely defines the behavior of the jet stream. Observations of the jet stream have revealed that warmer atmospheric temperatures do not always automatically translate into warmer weather. In a uniformly warmer and therefore more turbulent atmosphere, both warm and cold fronts end up and persist in places in the mid-latitudes in which they were not common in the past, often causing floods and droughts of magnitudes that we are poorly equipped to manage. So what we're seeing in Europe and North America is not so much warming as the destabilization of historic weather patterns. And people are complaining everywhere. The weather's all over the place. Well, the fact is that the weather is all over the place. And what we're now experiencing more and more widely are floods, droughts, and fires in the same river basins in the same year. And 2 years before the great floods in Canada in 2013, we already knew why. Recent research has demonstrated that in the Arctic and throughout much of the Canadian boreal, water that has been trapped as sea ice in glaciers and as permanent snowpack and permafrost is in rapid decline. And in 2011, our UN initiative organized a national speaking tour to communicate these findings and to profile the Northwest Territories water stewardship strategy, which, as I've already mentioned, we considered exemplary and worthy of the attention of southern jurisdictions. And one of our first venues, one of the first places we went to was Winnipeg. And we arrived in Winnipeg just after one of the largest floods in Canadian history. It appeared at the time of the flooding that the central Great Plains were approaching, or perhaps it even passed over an invisible threshold into a new hydroclimatic state to which many residents were finding it greatly difficult to adapt. Concern was being expressed that the loss of hydrologic stability could make parts of the central Great Plains uninhabitable, and that ongoing flooding could bankrupt over time affected jurisdictions. But it was also what the floodwaters carried that concerned us. As any of you who have been involved in a flood know, floodwaters carry within their murkiness every contaminant soluble in water. Dr. John Pomeroy and his colleagues at the University of Saskatchewan have observed an increase in rainfall on the Canadian prairies. Now, if any of you are from the prairies or spent time out there, you know what the usual regime is. In the summer, most of your precipitation comes in 2-hour bursts and thunderstorms. Well, what we're seeing now is that more rainfall is being produced by multi-day rainfall events generated by frontal storms coming, for example, from the Gulf of Mexico, as opposed to these shorter-term local thunderstorms. And what we're seeing is that this has a profound effect on water quality. Heavy runoff producing rains wash nutrients, bacteria, and toxic contaminants from agricultural and urban lands into waterways. And Pomeroy and his colleagues observed a 10,000-fold increase in the mobilization of fecal coliforms in these multi-day events compared to mobilization that occurs during localized thunderstorms. So what we see is increases in the intensity of and duration of extreme weather events that are seeming to become the norm are likely to cause further nutrient loading and contamination of lakes like Lake Winnipeg, which the Global Nature Fund recently recognized as Threatened Lake of the Year globally for 2013. Canada earned this unfortunate distinction because the judges were of the opinion that the geographical extent and the rate of eco-hydroclimatic change that are the causes of 15,000 square kilometer algal blooms in Lake Winnipeg were unparalleled anywhere else in the world. And the fear is that this might actually be the case. For those who haven't worked with cyanobacteria, I should point out one prominent researcher, I think, characterized it. He called these bacteria the cockroaches of the aquatic world, in that they're invited guests that just won't leave. These are early life forms that have survived ice ages, have survived asteroid strikes, which means that they're difficult to get rid of once they're present. And unfortunately, because of warming water temperatures and the increase in nutrients runoff, they're liking it better and better all the time in Canada. And they also appear to be becoming more toxic as their concentrations increase. Spring flooding also throughout the region has been increasing in the past decade, setting new records. Increases in the intensity and duration of precipitation events have begun to increase these inputs into rivers and lakes, but not just in the Lake Winnipeg Basin, but right across Canada. Recent research demonstrates that the cyanobacterian toxins have now been identified in 246 water bodies across Canada at levels exceeding maximum guidelines in every province. And I don't have to tell anyone here that these toxins are a known danger to humans and animals. And I also should point out that we're not alone in having this problem. Freshwater eutrophication has recently been identified as one of the 10 most worrisome environmental challenges facing humanity today. And I should point out also that Lake Winnipeg's problems just got a whole lot more complicated 2 weeks ago with the announcement that zebra mussels have finally found their way from the Great Lakes into the Lake Winnipeg system. So if you're trying to solve the Lake Winnipeg problem and you have cottages there, you might want to think of it this way. While your mother has been ill with some sort of immunological condition that doctors are having trouble treating, now she's fallen and broken her hip. Unfortunately, while Lake Winnipeg is a problem, a big problem, it's not the problem. The problem is much bigger. A combination of ecological, hydrological, and climatic change is altering the character of the interior of the continent. And it was with this realization that the lights really went on. While we may not have perceived it as such, what is happening in the Arctic and what's happening in the north is exactly what's happening in the much of the rest of Canada. Warming is causing the post-glacial hydrologic wealth of Canada to change form. The water's not disappearing, however. Water doesn't do that. What's happening is that liquid water is moving to a different place in the hydrosphere where it may not be available for our use when we want it, and where also, under certain conditions, it can cause a lot of damage through flooding. And we see that this is going to add additional edge to the already existing natural variability that characterizes weather and climate in much of Canada. And what these observations confirm is that warming temperatures are in fact energizing the global hydrological cycle. And I have to tell you, it's really evident where I live, in Canada's Western Mountains. There is now evidence that as many as 300 glaciers disappeared in the Canadian Rockies alone between 1920 and 2005. And there's evidence that this loss is accelerating. Now, I show this one because this is Glacier National Park in the United States. And a lot of public attention has been drawn to that because they actually knew what was happening to their ice. Now we know what's happening to ours. And what we're seeing is that the same warming that is causing permafrost to thaw in the north, glaciers to disappear in our western mountains, and changes in precipitation patterns on the prairies, also appears to be causing water left on the land after the glass glaciation in the Great Lakes region to evaporate. Now, we did a back-of-the-envelope calculation of the decline in water levels in Lake Huron alone, and it suggested that as much as 67 cubic kilometers of water may have disappeared from this part of the Great Lakes system since 1997. Now, we fully recognize that dredging of the St. Clair River at the mouth of Lake Huron clearly counts for a significant portion of the loss, but it doesn't count by any means for all of it. So the question we're asking is a question that's being asked right across this country and throughout the Northern Hemisphere. Where is this missing water going? One of the places we know it's going is into the atmosphere, where it becomes available to fuel more frequent and intense extreme weather events. And we're seeing this right across Canada and Europe and widely through the Northern Hemisphere. And the algorithm upon which this assertion rests is one of the most basic principles in all of atmospheric physics. Warmer air holds more water. The amount of water the atmosphere can hold increases by about 7% per degree Celsius, or about 4% per degree Fahrenheit. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is that our water supply systems and our urban and rural water infrastructure are all designed for an earlier, more stable climate. A report published by the National Academies of Science in the United States in 2011 confirms how serious the loss of hydrologic stability could be in North America and around the world if current trends persist. The report concludes that continuing to assume that the past is a guide to the future is no longer practical, and it's no longer legally defensible. What this means is that much of the old math and many of the old methods of managing water no longer work. These changing hydroclimatic circumstances have already begun to unmask liability. After the 2011 flood, the government of Manitoba spent $1 billion on disaster relief alone. And coincidentally, this was the exact amount of the government's deficit the following fiscal year. But in addition, the government of Manitoba now faces $1.3 billion in lawsuits related to the flood. So from this, we see that there is a direct link between hydrology and economy. And as we saw in Manitoba in 2011 and in Alberta in 2013, and I assume the pictures that Terry Reese showed say the same thing, uninsured losses can be 8 to 10 times greater than those covered by insurance. But insurance is not the only form of liability that's being affected by these events. Tort law challenges in the United States related to claims of personal and property damage due to flooding suggest that it will only be a matter of time before knowingly continuing to rely on outmoded methods and mathematics could ultimately land municipal managers, engineers, consulting professionals, and even political leaders in court. Scientific attention focused on atmospheric dynamics related to climate warming has also revealed some very interesting phenomena that validate the concerns of the U.S. National Academies of Science. For example, we have discovered the presence of what are being called atmospheric rivers. These corridors of intense winds and moist air can be 400 to 500 kilometers across and thousands of kilometers long, and they can carry the equivalent of 7 to 15 times the average daily discharge of the Mississippi River. Atmospheric rivers produce flooding of the magnitude that we saw in Australia and Pakistan in 2010. And also, we now understand that atmospheric river dynamics may have also been a contributor to the Great Lakes flooding in North America and in 2011. So you can bet that the issue of the acceleration of hydroclimatic change was very much on our minds on the evening of June 19th of this year, when rain began to fall in the small mountain town of Canmore, where I live. And as some of you have undoubtedly experienced, hydroclimatic change is no longer an abstract, academic, or theoretic topic if you've been personally affected by changes of this kind. And because it's so topical, and because it impacted me, my family, and many of my friends and neighbors so very personally, I'd like to conclude my explanation on what's happening to the hydrological cycle in Canada by way of recent disastrous flooding that took place in the town in which I live and downstream in Calgary and surrounding communities in southern Alberta in June of this year. Many people say that flooding of this magnitude could never have been predicted, but that's simply untrue. This was a 1 in 60-year event, if that means anything anymore. According to the Rocky Mountain Outlook, the town of Canmore began observing the rising creek waters at 7 p.m. on the Wednesday, the 19th. Nearly 5 hours before that, University of Saskatchewan hydrologist who I've already identified, John Pomeroy, who was in Canmore, sent an email to his colleague, Kevin Shook, who was in Saskatoon. He told Shook, who's an expert hydrologic modeler, that there had already been a lot of rain in the past week and rivers were already high. He noted also that spring snow melt was late and the snowpack was above normal for late June. And he told Shook that while the provincial agency responsible for flood protection in Alberta had issued a high stream flow advisory, it had stopped short of a flood watch. 7 minutes later, Shook responded. He said, in Canmore, basements start flooding at 240 cubic meters a second. He concluded his email by saying, this will be very interesting. Less than a half an hour after Pomeroy reported the rising waters to his colleagues, Cougar Creek breached the Trans-Canada Highway in Canmore. And within a few minutes of closing the Trans-Canada in both directions, the RCMP began knocking on doors in the Cougar Creek subdivision to warn residents to be prepared to evacuate. The rain and flooding continued throughout the night. At 5:50 a.m. on Thursday the 20th, Alberta Environment issued another flood watch update, but again did not issue a flood warning for Canmore. At 6:45 a.m., 23 truckers and an RCMP officer were trapped by floodwaters on the Trans-Canada Highway and had to be rescued by helicopter. At 8:45 a.m., almost 6 hours after a local state of emergency had been declared, Alberta Environment issued an official flood warning for Canmore. During the night, a spectacularly swollen pulse of floodwater flowed downstream from the mountains into the unprepared city of Calgary. 20 neighborhoods had to be evacuated, and more than 100,000 people were forced from their homes. But Calgary wasn't the only municipality that was in trouble. 12 southern Alberta communities had declared states of emergency. 8 communities besides Calgary were under evacuation orders. Flooding was particularly serious in small towns immediately south of Calgary. The floodwaters had risen so quickly in High River that residents were trapped in their cars and in their homes and had to be rescued from their roofs. The town of High River was almost completely inundated. 2/3 of the community flooded, and 5,000 residents were forced from their homes, including my sister and her husband, who lost everything. In Europe, storms of this magnitude are now being called decision-making rains. At 9:36 a.m., the Premier's office in Edmonton announced that Alison Redford would personally tour Lethbridge, Canmore, and High River later in the day. At 10:40 a.m., Prime Minister Stephen Harper left Ottawa to survey the damage. Aerial images of Calgary that morning show extensive flooding in many neighborhoods near the banks of the Bow and Elbow rivers, but also hitherto unimaginable flooding in the concentrated downtown area. The following day, some 1,300 Canadian soldiers were sent into flood zones. A clearly shaken Premier Redford announced $1 billion in emergency disaster relief. But I have to tell you that all the news concentrated on this, but other things happened then too that were not covered. What happened in Russia was almost beyond imagination. It's the stuff of science fiction. The weakening of the European jet stream caused by reduced snow and ice led to the creation of a heat dome over northern Siberia. And in July, hundreds of wildfires broke out that were so hot that they melted the permafrost below the burning forests, creating methane releases from the thawing tundra that added fuel to the fires. Then, in early August, in the midst of what was coming to resemble a virtual firestorm, 3 atmospheric rivers collided over the region and within 4 days created a flood that covered 1 million square kilometers. So what you get from this, we see floods and fires of a magnitude seldom experienced before in the same basin in the same year. And we saw the same thing repeated again right before our very eyes in Colorado. Fires and massive floods in the same basin in the same year. So I think the world is shrinking and maybe we ought to talk about this matter. So what can we learn from this? What does this all mean for you if you live or have a cottage on a large or small lake or river in a place that you might fear could be affected by accelerating hydroclimatic change? What we see from these changes, is the loss of hydrologic stability may be a much bigger problem than we initially thought. The realization puts 3 global tier lessons into relief. The systemic threats that we face are part of a single connected hydrological whole. Every part of the water cycle flows through and affects and is affected by every other part. Changes in the extent and duration of Arctic sea ice and northern snowpack and snow cover have already begun to have a cascading effect on weather and climate right down to the mid-latitudes. And when you look at this, no one knew what kinds of impacts would come from increases in temperatures on the hydrological cycle. But we see from this that the loss of hydrologic stability could be a societal game changer. It means that simply managing water in ways that are useful to us will no longer be enough. We now have to be alert to changes in the larger global hydrological cycle. And this is a huge new concept, and it's going to take a long time to get our heads around it. When supposed experts tell you that we don't have to worry because the Earth has experienced higher carbon dioxide concentrations and warmer temperatures in the past, what they don't tell you is that during those epochs, which do exist or did exist, extreme weather events lasted for days or even weeks. Our hydrologic cycle is accelerating, and this problem is not going to go away. There's already been a 4% increase in relative humidity globally over the past century, and predicted rises in temperatures between 2 degrees and 6 degrees Celsius will result in further amplification of the hydrological cycle by 15 to 40% or more. So what we see is that the new normal out there is that there isn't a new normal, and there won't be until we stabilize atmospheric temperatures. So unless we want our future to continue to be a moving target, sooner or later we may have to bring up the subject nobody wants to talk about, at least where I live in Alberta. So at the individual cottage level, there are 5 lessons I'd like to leave with you about the potential effects of hydroclimatic change as they have been observed through Canada. In the context of an accelerating hydrologic cycle, the watershed basin is the minimum unit at which water must be managed. We have to see these larger systems as interacting and self-referential, and this is an important step in doing it. And progress made in Ontario toward that is very helpful. Lesson 2, we absolutely need nature's help. While breakthroughs will be helpful, we can't rely on engineering alone to address this problem. In order to gain even partial control over the hydrological cycle, we have to enlist all the help that nature can provide us. We gain that help by protecting and restoring critical aquatic ecosystem function and reversing soil degradation wherever we can. Rising temperatures will continue to create more frequent and extreme weather events for which you need to be physically prepared in order to protect your property, your family, and your friends. There's a lot of public and private infrastructure in rural and urban areas that is vulnerable, and we need to take a broader look at what that means. Cottage owners should know that more frequent and extreme weather events will mobilize more contaminants off the land and from septic systems and act accordingly. We know from where these changes have taken place that you can double, triple, or multiply the amount of substance that go into water as a result of the intensity of these events. Controlling the mobilization of contaminants and nutrients will become even more critical as water temperatures rise and evaporation increases, which will elevate the risk of lower lake levels, algal blooms, and also the likelihood of further invasive species. We also know that the collapsing of the oxythermal barrier, the amount of cold water and oxygen in certain parts of lake systems, is going to change the structure of many aquatic ecosystems. So we know from this that there are no silver bullets. So if you see these changes occurring, then it's important to employ a suite of measures to mitigate or minimize impacts on your property, to assure your personal safety and the safety of your family, and the integrity of the shoreline community to which you belong. So finally, where do we go now? First, I think this is important to say that this is not the time to throw up your hands in helpless despair. The sky's not falling. The world's not coming to an end. What this is a time for leadership. This is a time for relentless and courageous citizenship. You are not without means. You're organized. You know what the problems are. You know what to do. And you know that cottage associations can help. And you need them, and they need now you to press for policy reform and understanding at government levels that will help us first recognize and then address these problems. There is still room to move if we wish to preserve what we have ecologically, aesthetically, and economically. But we would be wise to get moving, all of us, and to move as fast as we can while that room still exists. Thank you very much.